In this video, we will be reviewing the entire pre-final coverage of Neuroanatomy lab. We will be doing that through the annotations I've made. So let's get started. First, let's look at basal nuclei and what are its components through these annotations. So here we have a section of the brain, and in this section, first let's identify the thalamus. So this part right here, which is marked as 25, is your thalamus. Now, if you go anterior to the thalamus, you will have the head of the caudate nucleus. So basically, your basal ganglia is made up of different gray matter structures inside your cerebrum. Now, these gray matter structures are your corpus striatum, amygdala nuclei, etc. Now, this corpus striatum is nothing but the combination of your caudate nucleus and your lentiform nucleus. Now, I know that's a lot to remember, but let me simplify it for you. Here, anterior to the thalamus, you have the head of caudate of nucleus. And now, here you have the putamen. This is your putamen and this is your globus pallidus. So putamen and globus pallidus together form the lentiform nucleus. They form the lentiform nucleus. Now once lentiform nucleus plus your caudate nucleus, that gives your corpus striatum. And that is part of your basal nuclei. So in this diagram, what you have to remember is the location of the head of caudate nucleus. Where is putamen? Putamen is located more anteriorly. Basically, putamen receives all the fibers and globus pallidus gives an output. Okay, so putamen is located more anteriorly, whereas the globus pallidus is located posteriorly. Now, if you go lateral to this lentiform nucleus, which is your putamen and claustrum, here you have something marked as 10. This thin line here, thin tissue of gray matter is called your claustrum. Okay, and more lateral to it, here you have the insular cortex or the insula. Okay, now what about the body of the caudate nucleus? The body of the caudate nucleus just follows the head of the caudate nucleus. So this portion right here is the body of the caudate nucleus. Now let's look at the same thing but in an illustration based diagram so that you'll be more clear. This is the head of caudate nucleus. This is your thalamus. So as I said, head of caudate nucleus is anterior to the thalamus. Now if you go laterally, you will have the lentiform nucleus. And remember, lentiform nucleus, you will have the putamen comparatively little anterior and little posteriorly, you will have globus pallidus. And again, remember, through globus pallidus, you will be having output fibers, whereas through putamen, you will be having input fibers. Now, lateral to this, you have this thin gray matter called your claustrum. And more lateral to that, you have your insular cortex. Fine. You can also identify the tail of caudate nucleus. The tail of caudate nucleus is right here. Okay, this is the tail of caudate nucleus. The most posterior part of the caudate nucleus is the tail of your caudate nucleus. Now, here's another section. This is more of a coronal section of the brain. So in this section, first, again, let's identify where the thalamus is. So the thalamus is basically going to be right here in this part. So this 25 is your thalamus. Okay, just inferior to this thalamus, you have your substantia nigra. And how to identify this? Look at this place. It has black color markings. And basically, this place was named after this blackish appearance. So that is why it has its name, substantia nigra. It is just inferior to your thalamus. And again, let's look at the lentiform nucleus. Can you guess what constitutes the lentiform nucleus? The putamen and the globus pallidus. Putamen is a bit anterior and the globus pallidus is a bit posterior. And remember again, globus pallidus has output fibers, putamen has input fibers. Lateral to that, you have your insular cortex right here. Now what about the body of caudate nucleus? In this diagram, the body of caudate nucleus is right here because this is the coronal section. Okay, whereas the tail of the caudate nucleus is right here. Fine. Make sure you look at this diagram because this diagram is pretty important. Now, what about this? This is another section that we are going to look at. In this section, we can identify that this part marked as 7 is the head of your caudate nucleus. Okay, and this 14 right here is your thalamus. Not 14, basically this place is your thalamus. And laterally here you can see the insula. So I've just marked whatever is important in this view only. If you want, you can go take the McMillan's Atlas and look at every single part again and again. Okay, but for basal ganglia, these are the important points in this section. Once we go to thalamus, I will also be talking about what are the important parts there. Now, again, this is another section. This is the right part of the brain. Here you have the thalamus. Laterally to the thalamus, you have the lentiform nucleus right here, which consists of your putamen and globus pallidus, again to reinforce. And this is your caudate nucleus. So you can say this is the head of the caudate, body of the caudate, and then the tail of the caudate. Okay. Now, this is another illustration found in our Snell's book. In this illustration, you can easily view all these parts. So here you have the lentiform nucleus, which consists of putamen and globus pallidus, and here you have the caudate, the body of caudate, the head of caudate, the tail of caudate, and the tail of caudate ends in a bulging called as your amygdaloid nucleus. Okay, and just inferior to that, you have our hippocampus. Okay, and this hippocampus has a claw-like appearance anteriorly, and that is called your pes hippocampus. We will look at a better diagram of it soon. Now, that was about basal ganglia. What about thalamus? So first, here, as I said, the 25 marked here is your thalamus, or the 24. It is roughly here. Okay, so this 24 is your thalamus. What about the other structures that we can revise right now? The substantia nigra, which we saw just inferior to it, and the lentiform nucleus, which consists of your putamen and globus pallidus. And another important fibrous tract here is your internal capsule. This white fiber tract is your internal capsule, which brings down information from the corona radiata of the brain to the brain stem. This right here is your brain stem. So this here is the internal capsule. Fine, we will be looking at the parts of the internal capsule through another illustration soon. Now, what about this again? So here you can see this 14 is the third ventricle. And as I said, this is your thalamus. 14 is this part, your third ventricle, and the thalamus lies laterally to both the ventricles. So that is why it is over here. Now remember, this is the internal capsule. This internal capsule is going to have three parts. Okay, this internal capsule has three parts, and its function is to bring down fibers towards the brain stem. And it is going to bring down fibers from the corona radiata of the cerebral cortex. So this internal capsule has three parts, namely your anterior limb, the genu where it makes a bend, and then finally the posterior limb. All these constitutes the internal capsule. So from this diagram, the major point that you have to take over here is thalamus lies lateral to the third ventricle. What about this section? So in this section, this is your thalamus, this area. This area is your thalamus marked as 15. And now same again here, we saw this diagram already, right? This is your thalamus. If you can remember, this is your caudate nucleus. If you can remember, this is your lentiform nucleus. But see, between caudate and lentiform, you will have the white fiber tract called the internal capsule. So just let's go back here. See, between your caudate and your lentiform nucleus, you have the white fiber tract. So that is the tract present over here. Fine. So this is the right cerebral hemisphere again. Now, what about in this diagram? In this diagram, again, let's look at the different parts of the internal capsule. So see, this is your internal capsule. You have the anterior limb. You have the genu of the internal capsule. Genu is basically the bend of the internal capsule, and the posterior limb of the internal capsule. Now again, lateral to the third ventricle, you have your thalamus. So again, these are some illustrations of the thalamus which will represent the same thing. But in this diagram, what I want you to know is there is a lamina inside the thalamus that divides the thalamus into three nuclei, and that is called as internal medullary lamina. You can see that here. It has an anterior Y-shaped division. That will divide the thalamus into anterior nucleus of thalamus, the dorsomedial nucleus of thalamus, and the lateral dorsal nucleus of the thalamus. So this is the dorsomedial, lateral dorsal, and the anterior nucleus. And that is divided because of your internal medullary lamina. Now, just outside the thalamus, you have the external medullary lamina. Now see, before the substantia nigra, inferiorly, you have another mass, a red colored mass here, and that is your red nucleus. It has a reddish appearance. That is your red nucleus. Okay. Now, another section here. This is the third ventricle. And remember, anything immediately lateral to the third ventricle is your thalamus. So this part is your thalamus. And our thalamus, posterior and inferiorly, overhangs as a part called as a pulvinar. Pulvinar of thalamus. Now, this is a individual thalamus here. Okay. Remember the Y-shaped internal medullary lamina, dividing it into anterior, dorsomedial, and lateral dorsal nucleus. This is the internal medullary lamina. This divides the thalamus into nuclei. Okay, and the important facts that you must know here is the interthalamic connection, which is on the medial side of each thalamus that will connect the thalamus on both sides. Okay, and pulvinar posteriorly it overhangs. That part is pulvinar. Remember we saw here this part is pulvinar. So this is here pulvinar, and this pulvinar is going to have inferiorly your medial geniculate body and your lateral geniculate body. And please try to remember all these nucleus by yourself. Now, thalamus is done. What about hypothalamus? So the main thing that we must focus on hypothalamus is the location of the hypothalamic nuclei. But before going to that, we must understand the basic anatomy of hypothalamus, right? So let's look at it first. So this right here is your hypothalamus. This structure marked 19 is your hypothalamus. Now, in this hypothalamus, this thin part right here is called a lamina terminalis. Okay. And as soon as lamina terminalis, you have your optic chiasma here, 32. This is your optic chiasma. And this is your infundibulum. Okay, or you can call it infundibular recess. Okay. Now, this right here is your 49. Before the infundibulum, you have the tuber cinerum and the median eminence of the hypothalamus and pituitary axis. Okay, tuber cinerum and the median eminence right over here. Now let's look at this view. This is the inferior view of the brain. Here, this part where the optic nerve crosses is the optic chiasma. Okay, and just posterior to the optic chiasma, you have the pituitary stalk. And more posterior to that, you have the, which is marked as number 39, you have the tuber cinerum and the median eminence. Now, to have a clear idea about what these are, I have taken a illustration again from the Snell's anatomy book. So again, this thin structure in the most anterior part is the lamina terminalis. It's like a lamina, right? So lamina terminalis, as soon as that is over, you will have the optic chiasma, and then you will have the infundibulum, which will continue as your pituitary gland. In this diagram, again, the importance of this diagram is to know where each nucleus is located. And let's try to understand that logically. Okay, this is your ventricle. Fine, this is your third ventricle. Now, parallel to that third ventricle, you will have a nucleus called as your paraventricular nucleus. Okay, logic. Parallel to the third ventricle, you will have the paraventricular nucleus. Now, there are two major nucleus of the hypothalamus, ventromedial and dorsomedial. So those ventromedial and dorsomedial occupy majority of this place. Okay, so the ones which are occupying majority in the anterior part is the ventromedial nucleus, in the posterior part is the dorsomedial nucleus. Now just medial to the ventromedial nucleus, you have the infundibular nucleus, or this is also known as the arcuate nucleus. Now you will have a better picture of it when I show another section, a sagittal section of the hypothalamus. Now what about this blue one here? This blue one is the tuberomammillary nucleus. And more lateral to the tuberomammillary nucleus, you have the lateral nucleus itself. Okay, so just make sure you understand the logic behind its location. Paraventricular means parallel to the ventricle, ventromedial and dorsomedial occupy majority of these places. And then you have the infundibular nucleus, the tuberomammillary nucleus, which you'll better understand in another picture. And then you have the lateral nucleus. And this purple structure is your fornix, which belongs to your limbic system, which we will talk about soon. Okay. So in this, the hypothalamic nuclei are divided into two zones, your medial zone and your lateral zone. So in the medial zone, you have the following nucleus. Remember, this is the optic chiasma, right? This is the lamina terminalis. This is the optic chiasma. Just before the optic chiasma, you have a nucleus, and that is called your pre-optic nucleus. Just before the optic chiasma. So that is why it is called pre-optic nucleus. Now, what about the paraventricular nucleus? Remember, in that diagram, we saw the paraventricular nucleus is the one parallel. So this is your third ventricle. This is also parallel to the third ventricle, right? So that is your paraventricular nucleus. Now, what about this infundibular nucleus? I told it will be better understood in this one. So see, the infundibulum of the pituitary gland continues like this, right? The nucleus of the hypothalamus along this continuation is called your infundibular nucleus or your arcuate nucleus. Now, there's a tiny thing here, just above suprachiasmatic nucleus. Preoptic nucleus was before suprachiasmatic nucleus, but just above suprachiasmatic nucleus, you have the suprachiasmatic nucleus. I'm sorry, just above the optic chiasma, you have the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And here you have the ventromedial nucleus, which occupies majority of the part, and just posterior to it, you have the dorsomedial nucleus, which occupies majority of the part in the dorsal side. And this is your posterior nucleus, which you have to remember. What about lateral zone? In the lateral zone, majorly you have the lateral nucleus, which occupies most of the mass. Now this right here is the mammillary body. Okay, so when a structure goes from the mammillary body to the tube-like infundibulum, that place forms the tuberomammillary nucleus. So see, this is going towards the tuber-like part of the hypothalamus and pituitary axis. So that is why this is called tuberomammillary nucleus, from the mammillary to the tubal-like part. Tuberomammillary, remember like that. And the small here in the anterior part of the tuberomammillary nucleus is the lateral tuberal nuclei. And again, here you have the supraoptic nucleus just above the optic chiasma and the preoptic nucleus before the optic chiasma. Okay, and there's another thing that you can see here called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Okay, suprachiasmatic nucleus. I'm sorry again, supraoptic nucleus is just above the optic nerve, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus is just above the chiasma, optic chiasma. So remember like this, first comes the suprachiasmatic, second comes the supraoptic. So that was about the medial and lateral zone of the hypothalamic nuclei. Now, an important function, if you remember, we've been studying this since 11th or 12th standard. The supraoptic nucleus secretes few hormone and the paraventricular nucleus secretes few hormone. Okay, now everything makes sense. The vasopressin and oxytocin are secreted by these hormones present in your hypothalamus. Now again, to have a clear idea, look at this. Supraoptic nucleus is above the optic chiasma. Look at the paraventricular nucleus. It is parallel to the ventricular cavity right over here. Okay. Now again, to understand the blood supply or the hypophysis axial system, you must know that the superior hypophyseal artery starts from here, goes through the median eminence and enters the anterior lobe. Whereas the inferior hypophyseal artery enters the posterior lobe and then joins the anterior lobe to form a capillary network. The superior hypophyseal artery is a branch of your internal carotid artery. Fine. So that was all about your hypothalamus. Now what about your limbic system? Limbic system is the one that controls emotions, sense, sexual drive, and all those things. So the major parts of limbic system is your fornix, hippocampus, amygdala, and such. So this right here, this is your lateral ventricles, and this right here is your body of the fornix. Okay, and this is your corpus callosum for reference, and this is your body of fornix. And as I said, remember, just under the tail of caudate nucleus, this 22 right here is the tail of caudate nucleus. You will have the hippocampus. Okay. Now coming back again, the hippocampus in another section looks very different, right? This hippocampus is going to continue to the front and form claw-like appearance, and that is called pes hippocampi. And towards the posterior part, it forms finger-like appearance called the fimbria. And also it forms something called as the fornix. So 6 is fimbria here, and this is fornix. Here's another view of the limbic system. This is your body of fornix. So that time we saw a coronal section in which the body of fornix was round, but this time you can see the body of fornix like a tube in this section. Okay, in the transverse section of the brain. This is the body of fornix. Now what about here? Remember this diagram? This is the right cerebral hemisphere. In this you can see the fornix right over here. This 7 is your fornix. Okay, again, just to review, you can look at these diagrams by yourselves. Whatever we discuss there is also going to be here. But the additional point that I want to discuss here is something called as the indusium griseum. This is nothing but the gray matter covering, thin gray matter covering on top of the corpus callosum. Okay. Now again here, these are the same parts we discovered. We discussed pes hippocampi, hippocampus, fimbria, and the fornix. Now, what about this? This is your parahippocampal gyrus, and this is your hippocampus. And in the hippocampus, there is something called as your alveus, which are white matter fibers. These white matter fibers are going to form something called as your fimbria, which converge towards the hippocampus and go medially. Okay, they converge near the hippocampus and they go medially. So the place between this fimbria and the parahippocampal gyrus is called as a dentate gyrus. Okay, and this cavity is the cavity of the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle, and it is lined by your ependyma. Now, major fact that you must remember is alveus is a white matter continuation or a white matter fiber, whereas the indusium griseum is a gray matter covering on the corpus callosum. So this is another diagram that you can refer, the transverse section. You can see the indusium griseum on top of the corpus callosum. Now, cerebellum. So this is one of the last topics of the lab. Cerebellum and the autonomic nervous system is remaining. So let's go through this very quickly. Hold on. Okay. So the cerebellum, this is the sagittal section in which you can see the cerebellum. And inside the cerebellum, the fibers form a tree-like appearance. And that is why they are called arbor vitae. So arbor in French means tree. Tree, vitae is life. So this is like the tree of life. So that is why it is called arbor vitae. And this is your cerebellum. Now to advance, this is the posterior aspect of your cerebellum, or you can tell this as a posterior superior aspect of your cerebellum. The middle part, which looks like a worm right here, is the vermis. Okay? And this is your anterior lobe. So cerebellum mainly has the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. The posterior lobe is also known as your middle lobe, which is very big. Okay. This anterior lobe and posterior lobe is divided by a fissure called as your primary fissure, which is marked over here. Primary fissure. This is the right hemisphere of cerebellum. This is the left hemisphere of cerebellum. Now, to understand it even better, so look at this here. They have just took the cerebellum out from here and then they have flattened it right over here. Okay. So the anterior lobe is divided from the middle lobe by the primary fissure. So remember, the middle lobe is also called as your posterior lobe. Okay. And as you go posteriorly, you will have another fissure called as your horizontal fissure, which will separate the superior semilunar lobule of the posterior lobe from the inferior semilunar lobule of the posterior lobe. That is your horizontal fissure doing the separation work. Now, as you go more posterior and deep inferiorly, you will have a lobe called as the flocculonodular lobe. And this flocculonodular lobe is very weird, right? It is very unique, looks very unique. That is divided from the posterior lobe or the middle lobe by the uvulonodular fissure. So the major parts that you have to remember is your primary fissure, horizontal fissure, and the uvulonodular fissure. Now, the vermis right here has different parts as the cerebellum progresses, starting from your lingula, central lobule, your culmen, culmen, the declive, the folium, the tuber, pyramid, uvula, and then the tonsil. Tonsil is part of the cerebellum. So just remember what all are the parts of the vermis. We'll be looking at it in a better picture soon. So again, this is a cross section or a completely dissected cerebellum to show us the nucleus, the important gray matter structures present in the cerebellum. So medially, just above the cavity of the fourth ventricle, you have the fastigial nucleus. Okay, above the cavity of fourth ventricle, you have the fastigial nucleus. Let's go laterally. You have globose nucleus, 2 to 3 pairs of globose nucleus. More laterally, you have the emboliform nucleus. And finally, you have the biggest nuclei inside the cerebellum called the dentate nucleus. Okay, these are all the nucleus present inside the cerebellum. And the important fact right here to remember is the fastigial nucleus is located above the fourth ventricle cavity. Now, here are again some illustrations from the textbook that I would thought would be helpful. Again, to reinforce, anterior lobe is divided from the middle or posterior lobe by the primary fissure. And remember, this is the vermis. It is the culmen of the vermis. This is the declive. It's declining, right? So just remember something like that. So that is the declive of the vermis. Now, when you take the inferior aspect of the cerebellum, you have the pyramid of the vermis, the tuber of the vermis. And in the inferior aspect, you can see the flocculus even more clearly, the flocculonodular lobe. And this right here is the middle cerebellar peduncle. Okay, let's not go there now. I will show a better diagram to make you understand how the middle cerebellar peduncle looks. So in this diagram, again in the sagittal section, we will look at how the vermis descends down. Central lobule, you have the culmen, you have the declive, you have the folium, the tuber, the pyramid, the uvula, the nodule, the lingula. Okay, these are all part of the vermis. Fine. So you can look at this diagram for a better understanding. In the superior vermis, you can see these following parts: the central lobule, the culmen, the declive, and the folium. Okay, C, C, D, F. Central lobule, culmen, declive, and the folium. Okay, this is the anterior cerebellar notch. This is the posterior cerebellar notch. Again, to revise, the anterior lobe is divided from the posterior lobe by the primary fissure. And remember, the horizontal fissure separates the superior semilunar lobe from the inferior semilunar lobe. This is the horizontal fissure. Continues like that. Now, what about the inferior surface? In the inferior surface of the cerebellum, the major thing that you must remember is the cerebellar peduncles. Okay, a simple way to remember that is superior cerebellar peduncle is going to be the most medial structure. The middle cerebellar peduncle is going to be the largest peduncle, whereas the inferior cerebellar peduncle is going to be the lateral one. Okay, superior, middle, and inferior. So once you discover what is superior and middle, you can just tell the other one as the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Now here, this lobe, the flocculus, remember we saw the flattened diagram of the flocculus. This flocculus is divided from the posterior lobe by the uvulonodular fissure, if you can recollect it. Now again here you can see the inferior vermis and its parts, namely the nodule, the uvula, the pyramid, and the tuber. And parallel to the vermis in the inferior section, you can see the tonsil of the cerebellum. Now, again, to reinforce the cerebellar peduncles, take a look very clearly. Remember what I said. The superior cerebellar peduncle is the most medial one. The middle cerebellar peduncle is the most biggest one. Whereas the inferior cerebellar peduncle is more lateral when compared to the superior cerebellar peduncle, and it is small. The same applies in this section also. This is the superior cerebellar peduncle, which is more medially, and this is the middle cerebellar peduncle, which is more big, and this is your inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, these are just tricks to remember the locations of it. Middle means it's big, superior means it's medial, and inferior means it's comparatively lateral to the superior cerebellar peduncle. Now, the inferior surface, let's revise again. The superior cerebellar peduncle is more medial, and here you have the middle cerebellar peduncle, the biggest one, and this is your inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, Now the nodule and the flocculus together forms the flocculonodular lobule, which we saw in the flattened diagram also. Now again, to reinforce, the flocculonodular lobe is divided from the posterior lobe by the uvulonodular fissure. Okay. Now another diagram to reinforce things again and again. The anterior lobe is divided from the posterior lobe by the primary fissure. Whereas remember, the horizontal fissure divides the superior semilunar lobe of the posterior lobe from the inferior semilunar lobe of the posterior lobe. That is a function of your horizontal fissure. Now this is the histological slide of the cerebellum. Cerebellum forms something called as a foliae, which are folded appearance. Okay, and that is covered by your pia mater here. Fine, pia mater. Now, as we descend down, we will have three important layers. Your molecular layer M, Purkinje layer, which will have Purkinje neurons P, and then the granular layer, which will look granulated in appearance. And the innermost layer is your white matter. So you can remember it like MPG. Okay, and the white matter, which is obvious, and the topmost layer is your pia matter. And all of this form the foliae. And even here, you can clearly see the tree-like appearance. And if you can recollect, what is that called? It is called arbor vitae. Now, final revision of the nucleus of the cerebellum. The one on top of the fourth ventricle is your fastigial nucleus. Lateral to that, you will have the globose nucleus. More lateral to that, you will have the emboliform nucleus. And finally, the biggest one is your dentate nucleus. Okay, this is just a pictorial representation of the nucleus of the cerebellum. Now again, in the real cerebellum, where can you locate this? You can locate it here, fastigial. This is your globose, which are paired, or it can be three, or this is the emboliform nucleus. I would suggest you to revise the entire neuroanatomy lecture part so that you can understand more better about this nucleus, because I'm not sure regarding the globus nucleus whether there'll be two or three. So just make sure you refer that in the textbook. And this biggest one right here is your dentate nucleus. Now finally, what to remember in autonomic nervous system? In autonomic nervous system, remember this is the spinal cord, this is the anterior part, this is the posterior part. This is the anterior horn, posterior horn, this is the lateral horn. In the lateral gray column, you will have fibers going through the anterior root, and you will have fibers going through the posterior root too. But posterior root is going to receive sensory fibers. Anterior root is going to give motor fibers. Okay, and once it takes this path, it is going to enter something known as the white rami. White rami is nothing but it is myelinated. Once it enters the white rami, it is going to enter the ganglia. This is the ganglia. I'm just giving a rough idea. Make sure you go to the Snell's textbook too. So for leaving this ganglia, this fiber can go travel up, travel down, or leave the ganglia through the gray ramus, which is not myelinated, which is unmyelinated. Okay, so that is what I wanted you to understand about the general arrangement of the autonomic nervous system, especially the sympathetic one. Now, in a cadaver, you can see the ganglia located parallel to the vertebral column, which is seen over here. So those are called paravertebral ganglia. And this is at the thoracic level. So these are thoracic ganglia. Okay, and this is the entire thing is called the sympathetic trunk. Okay, now this white and gray rami communicantes can be seen here. Fine. So that was all about the neuroanatomy lab part. I hope it was really helpful for you. But make sure you go through the annotations and the pictures and the atlas by yourself once to clear things up. There might be a little bit errors here and there. If you find any, please feel free to tell me so that I can correct it and no one learns the wrong thing. And yeah, and at the end, make sure you go through the lecture part also. If you go through the lecture part in your book and in the notes that you made, this lab part is going to be really, really easy. Thank you.